93 minutes. That was all it took. On the 4th of July, 1918, near the little-known village of Le Hamel on the Western Front, a revolutionary attack was launched. For nearly 4 years, the front had been locked in deadlock, with major breakthroughs almost impossible. Yet, on that morning, Australian, American, and British forces unveiled a new way of waging war. In a single operation, they provided a blueprint, proof that trench warfare could be overcome, and that victory could be secured on the battlefield. This is the story of Le Hamel. To understand its importance, we must look back to 1917, a year that reshaped the conflict. First came the Russian Revolution. The Tsar was overthrown, and the new Soviet government, at great territorial cost, signed peace with Germany. Fighting on the Eastern Front ended. Next, in April, the United States entered the war, in part due to Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. America's immediate presence was small, but once her armies and industry reached full strength, they would spell disaster for Imperial Germany. For Berlin, these two developments created a fleeting opportunity. With close to 1 million troops freed from the Eastern Front, and before American strength could fully arrive, Germany resolved to strike. Elite formations, the stormtroopers, were assembled. The plan was bold: to smash the British back toward the Channel ports and drive the French south to defend Paris. On 21 March 1918, the Germans launched their Great Spring Offensive, an all-or-nothing gamble to defeat Britain and France before the Americans could tip the balance. The attack ripped through the British Fifth Army on the Somme, triggering a retreat of unprecedented scale, only halted with immense sacrifice outside Amiens. Then, in April, the Germans struck again. The Allied position was so grave that British Commander Sir Douglas Haig issued a stark order to every soldier under his command. There was no path left but to fight on. Every position had to be held to the last man. Retreat was not an option. With their backs to the wall, and with faith in the justice of their cause, the soldiers fought on with determination. The safety of their homes and the freedom of humanity rested on their shoulders in those critical moments. The battle later remembered as the struggle at Lys was eventually contained, but at a terrible cost. Then, in May, the Germans struck again. Once more the fighting was brutal and desperate, and once more the line was saved, thanks in large part to the sacrifice of Australian troops near the vital town of Villers-Bretonneux. By the time the battles on the Somme subsided, the German army's final chance of victory on the Western Front had slipped away. Yet the war was far from over. Months of bloody fighting still awaited. That new chapter truly began here at Le Hamel. As the Germans pressed the French to the south along the River Aisne, British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig was asked to relieve the pressure with local attacks. Among his forces were the seasoned Australians, holding a 17-mile stretch of the southern flank. Under the charismatic and highly capable Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, they had already proven themselves at Gallipoli, the Somme, Bullecourt, Messines, and Passchendaele. Now, once again, they were called upon to strike. On June 10th, Monash gathered his divisional and brigade commanders. His plan, to advance on a broad front when the time was right. But first, they needed to capture a prominent German position at the village of Le Hamel, on the southern banks of the Somme. Overlaying wartime trench maps with modern satellite views reveals the lines clearly. Blue marks show the Allied front in early July, while red marks indicate German defenses. Further thin red lines show deeper fortifications. By 1918, continuous trench lines had given way to a system of defense in depth. 3 zones: the forward zone, the battle zone, and the reserve zone. At Le Hamel, The German forward zone included strong points such as Pear Trench, Kidney Trench, and the woods of Hamel and Vere, all heavily fortified with machine guns. Beyond lay the village itself, set in a shallow dip, surrounded by open fields with deadly fire zones. Unlike much of the Western Front, this ground had not been churned into a wasteland of shell craters. While this allowed faster movement, it left attacking troops dangerously exposed. The stage was set for a decisive clash. As we draw nearer, beyond Le Hamel, the German main defenses dominate the battlefield. A ridge and woods that together form the natural bulwark known locally as the Wolfsburg. The high ground and the Akrock Wood to its south became the principal objectives the Australians would need to seize. Who would lead that advance? Monash selected troops drawn from 3 different brigades across 3 divisions to spearhead the assault. To the north, the 11th Brigade of the 3rd Division, under Brigadier General Cannon, would lead. In the center, the well-regarded 4th Brigade, made up of 3 infantry battalions and including celebrated figures such as Victoria Cross recipient Albert Jacka, would drive the main push. To the south, the 6th Brigade, recruited largely from Victoria, would press home the attack. Wikipedia +1 brief explainer on how armies were organized in the Great War helps make sense of these names. The smallest fighting unit was the section, roughly a dozen men led by a corporal. 4 sections formed a platoon of about 50 men, commanded by a lieutenant and assisted by a sergeant. 4 platoons made a company, roughly 200 to 250 men. And 4 companies plus support elements formed a battalion, nominally about 1,000 men under a lieutenant colonel. Typically, 4 battalions made a brigade, and 3 brigades a division. A division being a powerful formation of some 16,000 to 18,000 men, with artillery, engineers, signals, and medical units attached. Wikipedia Monash's attacking force at Le Hamel was a mixed, modern ensemble. American platoons from the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments were attached to Australian units so the inexperienced U.S. soldiers could learn front-line combat, while the British 5th Tank Brigade provided the new Mark V tanks to punch through defenses. In total, roughly 7,000 men, some 60 tanks, hundreds of guns, and numerous aircraft took part in the operation. Those reinforcements were particularly welcome. By mid-1918, the all-volunteer Australians were stretched thin and were suffering from sickness, notably the Spanish influenza that had begun to sweep the front. Wikipedia +2 Anzac Portal +2 eyewitness voices capture the mood. As Lieutenant Edgar Rule recalled, American platoons were distributed among Australian companies shortly before the attack. 12 were put in each platoon. They were dead eager, he said, and the arrival of fresh, enthusiastic doughboys visibly lifted Australian spirits on the eve of battle. The Americans came to learn. The Australians were proud to teach. Wikipedia opposite them, German numbers were smaller, but their defenses were no less formidable. Intelligence estimated a few thousand men in the forward and battle zones with further reserves behind, backed by dozens of machine guns and well-sighted artillery. Yet by 1918, the German Army too was feeling the strain of blockade, manpower losses, and supply problems, conditions that shaped the character of the fighting here. Wikipedia Monash planned with surgical precision. He split his leading tank formation into 3 groups, each with a clear objective and role. To the north, 15 tanks would spearhead the attack on the village itself, with the 11th Brigade advancing in 3 waves, first with the tanks, then a follow-up to consolidate, and finally a reserve to bring up supplies and strengthen positions. Other tanks were tasked: wire cutting and lane clearing, replacements for disabled vehicles, and a logistical role carrying ammunition and stores to keep the thrust moving. In the center, a dozen tanks would support the assault on the heavily defended Pear Trench position, while to the south, a final group of Mark V machines would drive for the Hamel-Akroch sector, with the 6th Brigade following. All of this was backed by concentrated artillery and air support designed to preserve momentum and limit costly, drawn-out fighting. ADOM.gov.O+1. The result, a tightly coordinated combined arms attack, would become a model for later operations. But on the ground, it came down to men, machines, and meticulous timing. A short, sharp blow intended to take ground and keep the enemy off balance. That was Monash's intent, and the battlefield was set. Ahead of the advancing infantry, British and French heavy artillery prepared a carefully timed, creeping barrage. Unlike earlier battles, there would be no prolonged preliminary bombardment. The element of surprise had to be preserved until the very last second. To further aid the assault, 1 in every 10 shells would be smoke, laying down a protective screen to obscure the attackers from German sight. The plan extended beyond the guns. Aircraft were tasked in multiple roles: spotting and correcting artillery fire, strafing German strong points, drowning out the noise of tanks, and even dropping supplies to advancing troops. To ensure true cooperation between infantry and armor, something that had failed before at Bullecourt, Australian soldiers were pulled from the front lines prior to the attack. They trained together with the tanks, rehearsed maneuvers, and learned to understand one another's roles. Massive scale models of the battlefield were built in the rear, allowing the men to study the ground, recognize landmarks, and memorize their objectives in detail. Nothing was left to chance. Even film crews were present to capture the preparations. With training complete, the attack was scheduled 3:10 a.m., July 4, 1918. The timing was deliberate, enough light for the Australians moving east to see their way, but still darkness blinding the Germans who faced west. On the night of July 3rd, as men and tanks moved into their start positions, tension was high. Lieutenant Edgar Rule later recalled the questions that haunted them. What luck this time? Who will be hit first? Do the Huns know? Are they waiting? What barrage will they bring down? Moments later, right on cue, hundreds of guns lit up the night sky. Captain Lionel Shaw remembered, everything was as still as death, broken only by the brilliance of German flares. Every few minutes Moss would ask, "Shorty, what's the time?" And I'd answer. Then, at 3:10, a line of flame leapt across the enemy trenches. The scene was overwhelming, the noise unbearable. You pitied the men under that fire, yet knew it was your only salvation. Under that rolling curtain of fire, whistles blew, and 12 Australian battalions, with their attached American platoons, surged forward into a storm of shrapnel and smoke. Staying close to the barrage was vital, but some, especially the eager but inexperienced Americans, pushed too far ahead and paid a heavy price. In the center, the 15th Battalion approached Pear Trench, only to be raked by machine gun fire behind intact wire. Their supporting tanks, delayed 4 minutes behind schedule, were nowhere in sight. A company bore the brunt of the onslaught, until one man stepped forward. Private Henry Dalziel, a transport driver who had volunteered for the attack, carried only a revolver. Spotting a machine gun through the haze, he vaulted the wire and single-handedly silenced the crew, killing or capturing them all, though losing his trigger finger in the process. His act saved dozens of pinned-down comrades. Astonishingly, Dalziel refused evacuation. Despite his wound, he repeatedly carried ammunition forward under fire until he was struck in the head near the final objective. Evacuated from the battlefield, Private Henry Dalziel survived his wounds and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary bravery. In a photograph taken shortly after, the bandage beneath his slouch hat is a stark reminder of the sacrifice he made that day at Le Hamel. With Pear Trench secured and one strong point silenced, the fight raged on. Fire from another key position, Kidney Trench, continued to exact a heavy toll until yet another act of courage changed the course of the fight. Corporal Tom Axford of the 16th Battalion charged forward, hurling grenades as he ran. With bayonet fixed, he stormed the machine gun nest, silenced it, and scattered the remaining defenders. His bravery, too, earned him the Victoria Cross, and unlike many of his comrades, he would live to see the war's end. As the Australians pressed on, they reached the edge of Hamel and Vere woods. In the dense undergrowth, tanks could not assist. The infantry alone fought through with bayonets and grenades in close, brutal combat. By 4:49 a.m., reports confirmed both woods had fallen, with over 400 German prisoners taken. Elsewhere, where the ground was more open, the tanks proved invaluable, crushing wire, overrunning trenches, and sweeping aside machine guns as they advanced relentlessly toward the village of Hamel. On the front of the 11th Brigade, Australian troops were the first to enter the burning village. They cleared it house by house and cellar by cellar, catching stunned defenders, many still in gas masks, unaware the enemy was already upon them. Soldiers of the 43rd Battalion later recalled how complete surprise had been. Some German machine guns were still covered, never even fired. Within minutes, Hamel was in Allied hands. Captain Moran, climbing onto the roof of a shattered house, fired 3 green flares into the sky, signaling victory. Their work complete, the 43rd paused while the 44th Battalion pressed on. With 12 tanks and heavy artillery in support, they stormed the ridge known as the Wolfsburg. The attack unfolded with near-perfect precision. Overwhelmed and demoralized, the German defenders surrendered in droves. Lieutenant Edgar Rule described how young, terrified boys emerged with bread in their hands, looking barely 15 years old. "We could not kill children," he remembered. "They ran with their hands in the air." By 5:13 a.m., the barrage ceased. The Wolfsburg was captured, Hamel and Vere woods secured, and every Australian objective achieved. Even the tanks, often unreliable in earlier battles, had excelled, with only 3 out of 60 failing. Their dedicated supply carriers delivered more than 12,000 pounds of ammunition directly to the front, a feat that would have previously required over 1,000 men. Hours later, a fierce German counterattack struck. In savage close quarters, fighting, bayonets, grenades, and trench clubs repelled the assault, leaving the ground littered with the fallen. Even the inexperienced Americans fought bravely. In that counterattack, Corporal Thomas Pope of the 131st Infantry Regiment earned the United States' first Medal of Honor of the war, charging and silencing a machine gun single-handedly. The Battle of Hamel lasted just 93 minutes, only 3 more than Monash's prediction, yet its impact was immense. The Australians lost 1,200 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans 176. German losses were heavier still, 2,000 killed or wounded, and 1,600 taken prisoner. The battle did not end the war, but it showed how victory could be achieved, through innovation, precision, and courage. For the Australian Imperial Force, the struggle on the Western Front was far from over. Many more battles lay ahead, but Hamel had set the standard.